All right, good morning. Good morning. There we go. Kind of got there, hey? Awesome. Welcome back. We are here to spend for our next session on Land as Grid, a discussion of historical element of colonial development into the grid that now defines land, both rurally and in urban centers. We will have both Elder Harry Lafond and Randy Klassen speaking with us today. I'll introduce both of their bios, and then Randy will start, and then Harry Lafond will come up after Randy. Harry Lafond is a leader, educator, and elder with a long history in Treaty 6 territory. He is from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, where he has served as chief and council member. He was instrumental in establishing Asimaganisikan Aski in Saskatoon. I said to Harry, if I said that wrong, please correct me later. I did okay? Oh, I got a thumbs up. Awesome. That is Canada's first ever urban reserve. Harry also served many years as executive director for the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. He is a deacon in the Roman Catholic Diocese of Prince Albert, and currently serves as scholar in Indigenous education at St. Thomas More College in Saskatoon. He has also been a longtime friend and collaborator of MCC and Mennonite Church Saskatchewan. This past June, Harry's many accomplishments were recognized when he was awarded the Saskatchewan Order of Merit. Randy Klassen has served with MCC in several roles since 2015. Including his current position as Indigenous Neighbours Program Coordinator for MCC Saskatchewan since March of 2020. Prior to 2015, he taught at Bethany College in Hepburn, Saskatchewan for 13 years and pastored in Alberta for 9 years. He is currently also an adjunct faculty at Horizon College. Randy is a lover of history and stories of the land and the night skies. He and his wife, Darlene, have lived in Saskatoon in the heart of Treaty 6 territory for 20 years. They are grateful to call this beautiful landscape home, where they've raised 4 children and welcomed 6 grandchildren, and are slowly learning more of what it means to live as treaty people. Let's welcome Randy.
Thank you, Denise. And it's really wonderful to be here. We've been enriched so much already this morning. So my presentation is the land as grid, how straight lines put the prairies on a crooked path. Now, one of the most noticeable aspects of travel across the prairies, and especially if one is flying across the prairies, is this patchwork quilt of fields that you can see. This endless grid of roads and fence lines and boundaries, and the often startlingly beautiful combination of colors, whether it's the myriad greens of a good spring, the staggering yellow of canola, the soothing blues of a field of flax, or the comfortable tawny of a stubble field after harvest. This grid is so photogenic, and it's such a vital part of our food chain and our economy. At the same time, we recognize that it is completely a cultural construct. It is unnatural. It's a human construct, something that has been imposed on the landscape. So in the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to explore this grid as a part of the journey of truth-telling and reconciliation. Now, I want to locate that story and truth-telling as close to home as possible, bringing some focus right here to Saskatoon and where we find ourselves located right now in the southeast quarter of Section 13, Township 36, Range 5, west of the 3rd Meridian. And some of you who have been raised in rural Saskatchewan probably understand that language, and others of you are like me that grew up not in this territory and not in a rural setting, and that's new language for me. So you do have a map on the back of your program, which comes from the RM of Corman Park. And some of the kinds of land that are referred to there are going to come up in the presentation. And that's there for your reference. Also, there we go. You can see where we are right here, though the pointer's not going to work on a screen. If you can't see the screen, don't worry. This is just for visual effect. You'll get the PDFs of this in the follow-up package that will come after the conference. So as we've heard in our first session this morning, the land was deeply known and experienced by its waterways. And there's a sense, well, not a sense, it is true that watershed is the most authentic way of defining a topography, defining a geographical territory. And when the Europeans came, they traversed and explored the land via the waterways, led by Indigenous guides, of course. And the descriptions of the land were oriented around watershed. A couple of notable examples that we could explore. I'll just mention them. In interest of time, we won't go into them more. But the Hudson Bay Company's Royal Charter of 1670, and you'll see that beautiful picture of the last time there was a King Charles. That's Charles II. But the description of the charter is all the waterways, all the lakes, rivers, etc., that flow into Hudson's Bay. Then there is the Haldimand Treaty, which is a century or so later, based in southern Ontario, talking about the land around the Grand River, which flows right through Kitchener-Waterloo nowadays. Or Treaty 6 territory. If you read the description of the territory, it's described by the lakes and the rivers. Treaties were traditionally grounded in this understanding of land as watershed. But the relationship to the land changed as we enter the era of Canada's vigorous nation building in the 1860s. As we look at that tumultuous decade, we will see in John A. Macdonald's massive nation building project that surveying the land was an integral element. Surveying gave the ability to divide up, to apportion and distribute the land. And so the grid was essential to this economic development. Now, you might notice that I'm wearing a grid today. I'm wearing, plaid, right? Plaid is I'm not the only one, I know that. But we also know plaid comes from Scotland. And I wonder, was there Scottish influence? Macdonald also, was there Scottish influence in this gravitation towards the grid? But I digress. At the same time as we talk about the economic dimension of this, engineering is often intertwined with the military. That's an association that goes back to ancient Rome and is still a significant part of military activity today. So in the case of Canada, we can see that the grid becomes an instrument of both the commodification and the conquest of land. So in the 1860s, the Hudson Bay Company governed the massive territory they called Rupert's Land. But the dwindling fur trade and growing Western settlement made this a huge burden for them. And so the territory, which is 40% of Canada's current landmass, was transferred to the fledgling country, the Confederation of Canada, with no consultation of the Indigenous inhabitants. Macdonald wanted to carve up the land and settle it. And this project began with the Red River Settlement, today's Winnipeg. So here you can kind of see a map that illustrates how the Métis settled, Red River and elsewhere, Batoche also, in long river lots. If you can see that, there's the winding blue river through the middle and then long strips. That is part of the French culture that they brought in there. Now, conflict erupted in August of 1869 when government engineers attempted to survey the Red River settlement and impose a new Canadian system of a square grid. which would fundamentally change how the community related to the water and to each other as neighbors. The arrival of the surveyors helped to spark the Red River resistance under Riel's leadership. Now, the surveyors were led by one John Stoughton Dennis, and I want you to remember that name. Dennis was a surveyor with a brief but disastrous military career. John A. Macdonald himself said he was a very decent fellow and a good surveyor, but quite without a head. So the result of that event, 1869, was that Manitoba was birthed as a province in March of 1870. Métis land rights were addressed to a degree, but they were later mismanaged, and the immigration of Mennonites in 1874 took advantage of some of that Métis land. So that was the first influx of Mennonites, the community out of which MCC itself grows. Now, undaunted by the debacle of the Red River Rebellion, in 1871, John A. Macdonald made that same J.S. Dennis Canada's first Surveyor General. And so the Dominion Land Survey was launched. Now, from a scientific perspective, the Dominion Land Survey is one of the most amazing engineering feats on the face of the planet. The world's largest integrated grid covering 800,000 square kilometers. It is something that is deeply ingrained in the infrastructure and the culture of prairie settler society. And even today, I mean, if you're trying to give directions to go somewhere out in the country, to give it in kilometers is completely ludicrous. It does not make sense because everything is measured in miles. A very brief overview for those of you that didn't grow up with this, how the grid works, how it was laid out. So the basic unit of the grid is this 6 by 6 mile block, the township. Townships are numbered starting at what's called the baseline, which was the US border, or the 49th parallel of latitude. And so you've got Township 1, and then you go north, and you've got Townships 2, 3, and 4. Each of them a 6 mile block. Going east-west, the starting point is an agreed-upon north-south line called the meridian. The meridian. And so you start at the meridian, and then you go west in columns, which are called ranges. Range 1, Range 2, Range 3. Now, I know some of my colleagues are not friendly with Excel, so this is kind of like a spreadsheet, but it's important to know these things. Okay, this is part of the truth-telling. Okay, so you get this grid of townships and ranges. Now, all of this would work out really well if the world were flat, and we know that there are some people who think that it still is. But in the real world, and even engineers know this, all of this is happening on a globe, which means that the lines don't add up. So look at the meridians, the large lines that are part of the Western Canada map there. The first meridian, the prime meridian, is located at Emerson on the Manitoba-US border. 6 more lines were established across the west as the surveyors traveled. And we here are located relative to the 3rd meridian. So the meridians, as north-south lines, will all converge at the North Pole if we follow them to their logical conclusion. So that means, practically speaking, every square is shorter on the top than it is on the bottom. Engineers have precise ways of accounting for this. The famous correction lines of the grid roads. How many of you have traveled where there is that little kink and you know this is a correction line thing? Okay, you have traveled in the country, you know this. The rest of you, we're going to have to go on a field trip sometime. So that is how the townships are laid out. Now the townships are also subdivided into units called sections, and that is the most common sense name I could ever think of for a subdivision of anything, a section, right? That's brilliant. So they start at the bottom right corner, the southeast corner, and they are numbered back and forth from bottom to top, as if you're on a horse riding back and forth, which I'm sure they were as they numbered those. So each of these blocks is a square mile, more or less, which is one section, or 640 acres. Now, the federal government had very strict regulations for how these sections could be used, and this pertains to pretty much every township of the thousands and thousands that were laid out. Sections 11 and 29, 2 sections in every township, were set aside for the schools. Now, the schools wouldn't need that full square mile, so they could sell off some of the land, and that's where education funding would originally come from until there would be taxation. Then, 1 3/4 sections, sections number 8 and 3/4 of number 26, were set aside for the Hudson Bay Company. This was their inheritance. After they got paid their pretty good deal for transferring all of Rupert's land to Canada, they still got a 5% cut on every township. So that's went to the Hudson Bay Company. And 1 3/4 sections out of the 36, that works out to about 5%. Now, here's the real kicker. This was the thing that really surprised me as I learned about how the townships were apportioned. Then, the railways got every odd-numbered section after that. Those are the blue ones. That's 44% of every township. Primarily the CPR that we've already heard mentioned, that went through Regina, chose Regina. That is a huge amount of real estate given to these business interests. Now, I'm going to take a bit of a detour from the history because there's a story that is connected to this. It's an important story for MCC and for many of us connected to it. So remember J.S. Dennis, the Surveyor General, who sparked the Red River Rebellion resistance? He had a son. Fortunate for us, he named him J.S. Dennis Jr., okay? It's simpler, same name. Dennis Jr. went to military college and became a surveyor like his father. He fought against the Métis at Batoche, then went back to surveying, rising high within the Department of Public Works. By the early 1900s, he had quit the government and was working for the CPR. During World War I, he was promoted to the rank of colonel. He spent some time with the Red Cross in Siberia. In 1921, back with the CPR, Colonel Dennis first heard that there were masses of Mennonites from Russia who were interested in emigration. Now, almost half a century earlier, as a young man, he had been present when the first Mennonites arrived in Manitoba, 1874. He had been impressed with them as settlers. And he thought that maybe the CPR could be part of the response to the Mennonites that are calling for help in the 1920s. And so, while the CPR almost never extended credit to immigrants, Colonel Dennis negotiated a $400,000 loan in 1923 to extend credit to the Mennonites and settle 3,000 of them. Now, this was done on a handshake with Saskatchewan Mennonite leader David Taves. This arrangement and the loans continued year after year until 1929 because there were more and more Mennonites who wanted to come to Canada. In Mennonite circles, this story has often been told with awe and gratitude. It involved an accumulated debt of over $1.7 million. And that saved and settled 21,000 Mennonites across the prairies. And then the Great Depression hit. With the economy totally tanked, at the same time as the migration reached its peak, repaying that travel debt was onerous, to say the least. Now, the headquarters of all this work was here in Rostern, and it was under the auspices of the accurately, but we might now say horribly named, Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization. And my grandfather was a part of that board. The debt's principal was finally paid off in 1946, 23 years later, and along with a portion of the interest. And the CPR forgave another $1 million of debt, of the interest. Colonel Dennis and the CPR were celebrated as saviors of Mennonite communities, not least at this 1937 celebration of Thanksgiving at a church in Coaldale, Alberta, which also includes Edward Beatty, who is the president of the CPR, going to this little Mennonite community. But it is also important to name, as part of truth-telling, that this miracle for my family and for thousands of others, and I'm guessing that at least some ancestors of people here, this derived from the CPR's landed wealth grounded in the grid. This commodifying of the prairies, all those blue sections in the township that were bequeathed to the CPR. And so it's a complex and troubling backstory that brought my grandparents and thousands of others out of the USSR in the 1920s. So let's return now to that backstory and the land that was set aside or reserved for First Nations. These lands were reserved by the Crown specifically for First Nations as a response to treaty. Treaty 6 specified one section allotted for a family of 5, or 128 acres per person. Here you can see a map of Reserve 107. As it was surveyed in the 1880s, 30 sections set aside of beautiful farmland just northwest of Laird. Now it's important for us to hear the wording that comes from Treaty 6. This is what it says. This is the treaty under which our lives here are governed. The Chief Superintendent of Indian Affairs shall depute and send a suitable person to determine and set apart the reserves for each band after consulting with the Indians thereof as to the locality which may be found to be most suitable for them. In the following years and decades, the government found many ways of working around the realities of consultation and providing what is most suitable. Let's talk a little bit about Saskatoon. John Lake is credited with the founding of Saskatoon. He was the Ontario land agent for the Temperance Colonization Society. In April of 1882, the society was granted 22 townships, 22 of the big blocks, to settle. And there you can see that, if you can see the screen, you can see it outlined in yellow. That was the land grant. Now the story is well known how Lake conferred with Chief Whitecap of the Dakota. That's the little, this is the reserve right here, where Whitecap was living, and we might say was confined to. Whitecap showed Lake the gentle banked area on the east side of the Saskatchewan River that he called Minnetonka, and suggested this would be a good camping area. This would be a good place to start the settlement because it would be easy to cross the river there, low banks on both sides. This is the section of Saskatchewan Crescent that is opposite Victoria Park nowadays, if you want to kind of ground yourself here. So Lake agrees and chooses that township that surrounds this land. So that's the white square in the middle. This is where he says, this is where we're going to start the colony. So it's Township 36, Range 5, west of the 3rd Meridian. But John Lake runs into a problem already. He can't settle where Whitecap suggests. Okay, so this is the township now. Lake wants that one right there. But if you remember the numbering, that is Section 29. And Section 29 belongs to the school. So Lake can't have that, so he takes Section 28. That's where he ends up. So that is where Saskatoon begins in today's Broadway district. If you go to Broadway now and go, I think it's on, is it on 10th? I can't remember, but thank you, I'm seeing nods. We have the Marr residence, which is Saskatoon's oldest surviving house in in its original location. So built just 2 years after the lake was there. The house is still there. You can go there for tours. And it's located there. And just to connect us to the story, the marker that anchors this original township, because we are right here. There's Lakeview Church, just into section 13, section 12, and this is section 1 here. And if you go to this intersection, that's where you can see this marker that says legal landmark. I can't read it from this angle, but if you look closely, it's there. I don't think this goes back to the 1880s. It's probably from mid-20th century, but it says do not disturb. Okay, so do not disturb, but you can go look at it just to see. This is how we are anchored, and I'm guessing every township will have something, a marker like that to say this is how the townships are marked. So this is Lake in 1882, talking about where he wants to be in Saskatoon. Meanwhile, back in Ottawa, more changes were afoot. While John Lake was still on his way to this territory in the spring of 1882, hiking up from Moosomin, the Northwest Territories, this vast territory, is being divided up by Ottawa into 4 new administrative districts. Districts of Athabasca, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Assiniboia. Now, if you read the Edmonton newspaper that came out right after this was these 4 districts were set up, Edmonton, they were really complaining. They did not like the name of Alberta. They said, why name it after somebody who's not even been here? Like the name Alberta, that sounds like that would be appropriate for a baby girl, but not for a province. They suggested, how about the province of Buffalo? Like that's got strength. So that's an idea that goes back to 1882. Now, what I want you to notice is that Saskatoon is just north of this new border. There. Okay, Saskatoon, that's Saskatchewan up there. This is Assiniboia down here. So that border is just 1 township south of where we are, or 8 miles south of the road right there. And in fact, that border runs between Saskatoon and the Whitecap Reserve, which makes me wonder, was Whitecap and his people aware of this? So the border was created in May. Whitecap and Lake talked in August. Did this play any kind of a role in how Whitecap was relating to John Lake and the coming settlement? Was he shrewdly distancing himself, putting them in a different jurisdiction, as much as he was welcoming them to the territory? I don't know. I raise those as questions. I have talked to a couple of people. I would love to know if there are Indigenous knowledge keepers that might have some inkling of this, but haven't got that far in the research yet. But it's an interesting question. Okay, moving forward. On the story of the grid, overall, the story of the grid intended to distribute land for Euro-Canadian settlement became a story of conflict and displacement and the lack or the loss of land for Indigenous peoples. Let me outline just a couple of reasons. First of all, there is starvation and displacement, the basic realities of the crash of the bison economy in the 1870s, as well as inadequate records of where the different bands are as they are traveling around trying to find food and trying to survive. And so the records of how many people are in this band, and so how big should the reserve allotment be, those records were quite insufficient, inadequate. Secondly, there is the aftermath of the Northwest Resistance at Batoche, the 14 so-called rebel bands who were treated punitively, harshly by the federal government because the government thought that they were aiding the Métis. There was direct government pressure. Wilfrid Laurier, especially, pressured bands to surrender their reserve land for cash. Hundreds of thousands of acres were surrendered this way. And the Indian Act was amended to make it easier for the government to do this so that it remained legal even though it was highly unethical and highly coercive. Then there was World War I. There was opportunity to take land for higher production, taking it from the First Nations, but also veterans were given land after the war through the Soldier Settlement Board, who acquired more than 85,000 acres from reserves to give to returning soldiers. And then there's industrial expansion. Flooding, a well-known case that is still before the courts. The White Sand Dam, completed in 1943, flooded 600 acres of the Peter Ballantine Cree Nation Reserve. They are still fighting for it. Along with these injustices, the Indian Act was amended in 1927 to prohibit bans from hiring legal counsel for land claims. So not only did they have a case against the government now says, well, but you can't hire a lawyer unless we say so, which is a double bind as more than I can imagine. So that section of the Indian Act was removed in 1951. 1905, Saskatchewan and Alberta are formed as provinces. Now this creates a major complication for treaty purposes and intermediate level of government in between the two treaty partners of the Crown, represented by the Government of Canada, and the First Nations. And that complication becomes much worse in 1930 with the Federal Natural Resources Transfer Act, which gives provinces control over the land and natural resources. So this is the bank account, or this is the RRSP, out of which the federal government, the Crown, is supposed to honor all its treaty obligations, but now they've given control of their RRSP to the teenager in the family, the province. So that's the situation that happens. So that has created the split regime for administering land that we are faced with now in Canada. So as I was looking into this, and I'm close to done here, the legal framework for land, we talk about being landowners, but officially, legally, only the Crown owns land in Canada. Only the Crown. The federal government administers 41% of that. Provincial governments administer 48% of that. And then private landowners, that's, if you've got a mortgage, if you've got a lot, or if you've got rural land, we hold title to the land. We don't own the land, the Crown owns it, but through the administration, we hold title to that land. That is the official language. And that's 11% of Canada. So looking at the 41% of federal government, this is where it comes from. The vast majority is the Northern Territories. The little green slice there is national parks, and the tiny slice is reserves. Okay, so that's federal land as it's administered in Canada. On the provincial side, each province has its own relationship with how it manages Crown land. Here we can see the proportion of provincial Crown land in the West. So in BC, 94% of the province is still considered Crown land. Manitoba, it's 90%. Ontario as a whole, it's 87%. Northern Ontario is 95%. So they're all 90 and above. Alberta, only 60% of the province is Crown land. And Saskatchewan is the smallest, only 58%. More Crown land has been sold off here. And just to say that these look close, but we should also recall that 10% of Alberta is federal national parks. And so they actually would go up more if we included the federal administered Crown land. So this is where Saskatchewan is in relationship to holding or selling off Crown land. Now, selling Crown land is always a one-way transaction. Once it's given title to a private landholder, it cannot be remade as public Crown land. In a moment, we'll hear from Harry Lafond, who is going to speak on some of the ways forward. So I would like to close with just two reflections on the land as grid. The obvious one is that there are many injustices, historic and current, arising from colonial gridlock, the conquest and the commodification of Mother Earth. And I wasn't surprised to see on this morning's Star Phoenix, again, the headline, "The Fight for Resource Rights." It's like on almost in every daily newspaper, you can find something that has to do with land. And so in the article with This is the Onion Lake Band, they're referring back to the Natural Resources Transfer Act and how that was done without consultation and is part of the problem. Secondly, there is a cultural dimension to this presence of the grid. It's expressed well in this cover illustration from a recent book by J.R. Miller. Just two ways of thinking, a grid and a circle. I was told a few years ago by a young Indigenous leader that reconciliation won't really happen until white folks learn to think in circles. And if that raises a question mark in your head, it's probably because you might be a white folk. It raised lots of questions in my head. What does that mean? At the same time, the earth is circular. The earth is a globe. And in the end, even engineering tells us that square grids need to accommodate themselves to the round shape of the land. Correction lines are essential to travel these grid roads. And so I'm learning, and I hope that we are learning, that reconciliation is also a road with many correction lines. And if that can help us to think in circles, that will be good for us all. So now, as I invite Harry to come forward, I would like to take you a half mile down the road to what is Treaty Land Entitlement land. We'll just start here. Is it going to go? Yeah. We're not going to walk there. You can just follow the road. But just down the street here, half a mile, is land. If you look on your map on the back, you see Cowessess TLE, Treaty Land Entitlement Holdings. And so this land is close to us as well as Crown land. You can look on your map and you can see Queen Elizabeth has her name on, well, now they're going to have to change the maps, right? King Charles. But has his name on some of the land that's just right around here as well. So this is where we are, and there are significant ways forward, and there's need for much more work. So Harry, please. So Harry, I would like to present you with tobacco as well for the wisdom, for the teachings that you're going to offer us. So thank you very much. Actually, no. I should have, let's just get it back to them.
Well, good morning. Miuki Sagansino. It means we have a beautiful day. Take a look. And it's beautiful in many different ways. It's beautiful because the sun is shining, but it's also beautiful because we're here to appreciate each other's way of relating to the land. We've heard three different stories so far. And those stories there are differences, and yet there are connections. There is common ground in there, and it helps us to try to negotiate an understanding of the world that we live in here in Saskatchewan. The Muskie Lake First Nation, that's where I come from. We're actually Cree, I guess, Cree Nation. We're one of a large nation of people who live right across the boreal forest of Canada, coming all the way from the Labrador and going west all the way to the Rocky Mountains. That's Cree territory. and we've moved and lived on that land for a long time, for many generations. My community exists just north of here, about an hour's drive. And I'll set the background so that you understand why we've taken the action that we've taken concerning land over the last 50 years. All the things that Randy was talking about in terms of MacDonald and Laurier and all the other prime ministers of this country have in one way or another affected our relationship to the land and how we are to live. Well, in Muskeg, one of the first things that we've had to deal with is that count. He was talking about, one section for every 5 people. Well, apparently they didn't know how to count in 1880 when they were in our territory measuring off the land. So that's been one of the issues, Treaty Land Entitlement. What should we have received under the terms of Treaty 6? The second big item that we've had to deal with, and during my grandfather's time, is the other issue of land-hungry government. They started off by hiving off a good portion of Mistawasses, which is our neighbor to the north. At one time, Muskeg and Mistawasses were connected to each other because we're related. Our people have, moved back and forth between those two communities because we're related in one way or another. And our turn came in 1919 after the First World War. After hiving off another section, another big piece of Mistawasses, they moved south and came into our community and took advantage of the absence of leadership in our community because the chief had died. Chief George Greyeyes had died. And so there was a kind of a period there of where the community had to select new leadership. The government used that opportunity to quickly, in a space of 3 weeks, hive off 1/3 of our community, the best farmland that we had acquired through the first survey. And this particular piece of work took 100 years to be resolved. That's it required a tremendous amount of resources to get to the truth of the story, and we still don't have the full truth because the federal government denies up and down that they did anything wrong, but nevertheless will pay you anyway. Which I don't know how you view that kind of position. The third thing that we've had to and continue to grapple with is that Indian Act of 1876. While Morris was talking to Mr. Osses in Atakakup and Kitawehau in Fort Carlton, MacDonald was talking to his legislators in Ottawa and creating this onerous legislation that would help the management of the Indians of this country. And basically, what happened was that the Indian Act was passed in Parliament, implemented, and it completely nullified the terms and the belief of the value of Treaty 6. And so that's why I worked for the Treaty Commissioner's Office for 12 years, is to try to bring alive that relationship that was intended to be the way of the future in living with the settler community, and doing it in a way that was just, and doing it in a way that respected and honored the land that we live on. So those are the things that confront every First Nations community in Canada, but more particularly here in Saskatchewan, because we have to contend with the 1930 land transfer agreement, which from the Indigenous side is a very illegal move that the federal government committed in transferring land to another government without consultation and a respect for the treaty relationship that they had signed. So, Muskeg Lake. Well, fortunately for us, we've been able to manage, I think, the commodity thinking way of our society and our culture here, and at the same time to work to or strengthen our own belief system that Lyndon was talking about, the relationship to the land and that sense of that ownership is not really a concept that fits into that relationship. I think as a community we've been managing it as best we can in the environment we live in here in Saskatchewan and Canada. So early in the 1980s, we were fortunate to have Lester Lafond working here in the city of Saskatoon, building up his expertise in the economic thinking of Saskatchewan society. And he acquired some really thoughtful, forward-looking team members. Lauren Larson from McKercher Law Group, and Dal McCloy from Winnipeg, who had acquired some really solid expertise in land claims. So they did the research, and they found that there were, I think, about 35 people miscounted in the initial setting aside of the reserve. It took 10 years to convince the federal government that these numbers were accurate, that the research was solid, and that they owed us land, a significant amount of land, and we hadn't had this land for over 100 years to help us grow as a community. And we were dirt poor. I mean, we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together most of the time because we were on federal funding, and we had to count every penny and report every penny back to the federal government. We had no other resource to work with in our community, so we were dirt poor in the 1980s. Anyway, so Lester Lafond and his team and Chief Wallace Talpisim of the day worked really hard. And their vision was we could acquire land adjacent or close to the home reserve, but what would we do with it? So the commodity thinking we have to deal with that. That's part of the reality of creating wealth for our community. And so instead of moving in that direction, they looked to Saskatoon. They looked around Saskatoon, and they began to build a relationship with Mayor Wright one-to-one. And in the course of those 10 years, they continued to work on this relationship, talking, meeting, and looking where land was available. And they found it. It was 35 acres, just down the street, down past College Drive and McCurcher, 35 acres. So they put claim in, and then became the struggle. And this is where colonized thinking really shows its face. Because we had to contend with people, both in government and in the city of Saskatoon, who had this notion that Indians didn't know what to do with land. They didn't know how to make it work for them, like it did for everybody else. See, it's a way of thinking that it was very difficult to deal with. But fortunately, it's the relationship building process with Cliff Wright that helped to begin to open doors for movement. And at the same time, we had Bill McKnight. If you remember, he was a treaty commissioner for a number of years here. He was also a member of parliament for many, many years. Bill McKnight was assigned the portfolio of Indian Affairs Minister, and he was a unique politician in the sense that he was not afraid to look at situations differently, and so he became an advocate for this process. And so in 1988, we acquired 35 acres of land here in the city of Saskatoon, and we haven't looked back. If you drive by there, it looks like Saskatoon. And that was the whole issue. Here in the city, some people were saying, what's it going to look like in a couple of years' time? Old vehicles on their tops and tall grass and, just the thinking is not helpful. Anyway, so that we accepted that we had to do some commodifying thinking around the land, but only to a certain extent, only to the point of allowing business to develop on that land. And to be able to work our way or negotiate our way through the Indian Act, which prevents a lot of things from happening that most businessmen would be quite comfortable when it comes to working with land. What we did was we accepted the fact that we had to pay the city of Saskatoon for their services. It didn't make sense otherwise. You're not going to start digging wells on that piece of property and creating a whole independent, isolated system. So we worked through all of those pieces, and it's worked for us. What at one point at one point we didn't have any nickels to rub together. Nowadays we have a development there that numbers somewhere in around $25 million, or in that neighborhood. But it creates a wealth for the community, and that is where we begin to create that balance. The money belongs to the collective, not to individuals. It isn't our way to hive off a piece and say that's mine. It's the businesses are developed and are set up in such a way as to benefit the collective, the Muskeg Lake people. Meanwhile, back on the home reserve, what we've gained here has helped us to strengthen our sense of relationship to the land that is Nehio thinking, Nehioak. We are grappling with the other war-related practice that the government had, and that was the allotting of land to veterans when they returned. And we had over 50 people enlisted during the Second World War. When they came back, the government, in its generosity and wanting to resettle the veterans, acquired as land and provided it to these veterans. Well, in our case, what they did was they took a little bit of their collective land and gave it to the veterans. So they gave them back their own land. And so we're dealing with that because it doesn't fit the way we think. We're accepting the fact that this has happened and we can live with it. But now what we are doing is we are working in the community as part of our community development to reinforce this collective thinking. The collective is what makes us strong. It's the strength of the family multiplied by the number of families we have in the collective. That's what makes us strong. That's Wakotoin. And so in that process, then we are no longer providing CPs, which is like ownership. That's no longer happening. And we're looking at identifying what is special about the land to us as people. And so we have places where we educate. We have places where we collect medicines. And when we look for land that supports our thinking and our culture. So we are creating this balance for ourselves so that we stay true to our Nehio thinking and be able to separate, what the compromises that we have to make to create the wealth that we need to be able to strengthen our Nehio worldview. And so it'll continue. It's like this for most of the communities. Kawasis, they picked land just down the road from here for the same reasons. There's great potential for economy around cities. Cities like Saskatoon is rare in terms of city personalities because it has, since Mayor Cliff Wright first came forward and really supported urban First Nation communities, Saskatoon has grown to be a leader in that area in its thinking. And I can attest to that because I tried while I was chief, to acquire land in Prince Albert, and it was like running against the walls of the penitentiary there in the thinking of the people. They didn't want us. They didn't want us Indians in the city. And it was a reality that we had to deal with, so we just walked away and said, there are better places for us to live than in this kind of an environment. But I think as a society, as a larger collective here, we need to take every opportunity to talk to each other, to connect with each other, because a lot of times what stands in the way is fear. It's a fear of the unknown, and if we can talk to each other, we begin to get comfortable, and we find common ground. You know, we like the same thing. We like to go to the Rame Modern, or we like to go walking along the river bank. We find common ground to things that we can talk to, and out of those seeds that we plant, we begin to trust each other, and with trust, the fear begins to disappear. That's what we have to work toward. That's what reconciliation is about. That's that process of trust that comes. And that's why I like inviting Mennonites to my community, so they can know that Muskeg people they're okay on most days. And vice versa. You know, my people are afraid a lot of times to go out, and we're trying to teach our children, be comfortable. And so we have Blenheim School and Lee School coming onto the reserve to use our cultural camp and to get comfortable, just to get comfortable, and deal with those stereotypes of reserves are dangerous places. I think it's more dangerous in Saskatoon than it is on walking down the road in Muskeg. But that's the reality we deal with. So land is a big thing for us, but for a different reason. We have to stay true to who we are. Lyndon identified language as being important. Just as important is this relationship to the land. The land is not there to be owned. It's there to be honored as a life-giving force of human beings. When they teach us about, where do we fit in the hierarchy of creation, we're at the bottom, because we depend on everybody else to stay alive. And I find it interesting too that in the creation story of the Cree people, and I read in Genesis, really we started at the same place, in terms of God's plan for creation. I think humans tend to interpret sometimes to their own benefit. And I think Genesis has been used or misused a little bit sometimes by different cultures to try to accommodate a way of thinking about land. I think Genesis kind of supports this notion that creation was made to help us to live, not the other way around. So, thank you very much, and let's have a good lunch together.
Thank you very much, Harry and Randy. Another educational session, I think, for us all. I feel, again, super privileged to be here with both of you, as I'm sure all of us have already this morning.